September 1944. A dusty, sun-scorched replacement depot near Le Mans, France. A group of men in fresh fatigues stands in line, their eyes fixed on the crates being cracked open by the logistics crew. These soldiers expect the standard-issue semi-automatic M1 Garand rifles they were promised during training. Instead, the heavy wooden crates reveal rows of scarred, bolt-action Springfield rifles from the First World War. The battalion commander steps forward, his face hardening as he realizes the trap. He approaches the supply officer, but the man behind the desk simply waves him off, pointing to a ledger marked with a clear, exclusionary label. The soldiers realize they are being sent to face German automatic weapons with equipment that belongs in a museum. The silence in the depot is absolute, but it will not last for long. The general is already on his way. This is the story of what happened when prejudice met the harsh reality of the battlefield. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when old hierarchies meet new realities. In a war fought with machines, some men dared to decide who was worthy of the best and who was relegated to the obsolete. And this is the moment that forced them to face what they had done. Major Charles Dobbins was 33 years old, hailing from the heat and red clay of Atlanta, Georgia. He commanded a black infantry replacement battalion that had been forged in the crucible of rigorous, unforgiving training stateside. Dobbins was a man of quiet professional pride. He had spent his career mastering the mechanics of infantry tactics, believing that a soldier's worth was measured solely by his competence and his courage under fire. He had buried friends in the training grounds back home, men whose potential was cut short by accidents and errors, and that loss left a jagged scar on his conscience. He understood the lethal geometry of the front lines better than most, knowing that in the hedgerows of France, seconds mattered, and the quality of steel in a soldier's hands often dictated who lived to see the next sunrise. He stood on the tarmac, staring at the crates of obsolete weaponry, fully aware that he was now responsible for the lives of hundreds of men who were being sent into a modern meat grinder with nothing but outdated 5-round bolt-action tools. Opposite him stood Captain Wallace Reed, 34, an ordnance depot officer who had come to France from the comfortable, structured offices of Trenton, New Jersey. Reed was a man governed by a rigid, toxic worldview that categorized soldiers not by their capability, but by the color of their skin. He operated his depot with an air of cold, administrative superiority, maintaining 2 distinct inventory ledgers that were locked away in his pristine, well-organized office. He lived by the belief that equipment was a privilege, not a necessity, often remarking that colored units were only entitled to the secondary salvaged stock, which he deemed perfectly adequate for their station. His uniform was always pressed to a razor's edge, his shoes shined to a mirror finish, and he carried the unshakable arrogance of a man who believed he was serving the war effort by enforcing his own private brand of segregation, oblivious to the fact that his pen strokes were effectively signing death warrants for the men waiting on the docks. By September 1944, the Allied advance across France had reached a critical, strained phase. The rapid dash from the Normandy beaches had overextended supply lines, turning logistics into a chaotic battle of its own. Gasoline, ammunition, and modern weaponry were in constant, desperate demand as divisions raced to stay ahead of the retreating German forces. This scarcity meant that replacement depots became pressure cookers where every crate of equipment held life or death implications for the thousands of fresh soldiers waiting to be fed into the front. In this environment, systemic inefficiencies and deep-seated prejudices often dictated the flow of supplies, while the front lines demanded absolute uniformity to maintain combat effectiveness. The reality on the ground was often managed by local commanders and bureaucrats who clung to outdated social structures. The allocation of weapons had become a fragmented, arbitrary process. Modern M1 Garand rifles were the gold standard for any infantry unit expecting to survive a meeting engagement against German automatic fire. Yet the disorganized state of the supply chain allowed officers with regressive ideologies to hoard priority equipment, Other commanders had largely turned a blind eye to these imbalances, either through apathy or a quiet acceptance of the status quo. It was easier to ignore the discrepancy in armaments than to challenge the entrenched racial divisions that had already been codified into the back end of the depot's supply systems. The chaos of the breakout provided the perfect cover for these practices, allowing discriminatory policies to persist under the guise of logistical necessity. The tension at the Le Mans depot was not an isolated incident, but a clear symptom of a rot that had been allowed to fester away from the eyes of higher command. The sun beat down on the rows of discarded bolt-action rifles, casting long, sharp shadows over the depot floor, while Major Dobbins stood at the center of the loading bay, waiting for a response that would determine the fate of his battalion. "Captain Reed, I need to discuss the requisition for my battalion's equipment," Dobbins said, his voice measured but tight. Reed didn't look up from his desk, his fountain pen scratching rhythmically across a ledger. "The allocation list is finalized. Major, your men are slated for the Class B shipment." Dobbins stepped closer, placing both hands firmly on the desk. "My men are infantry. We are headed for the front line. Class B is W1-era bolt action. The enemy is equipped with automatic weapons. They need M1 Garens." Reed finally looked up, his expression unbothered, almost bored. "The Springfields are perfectly adequate for your unit's requirements." "Adequate?" Dobbins leaned in, his jaw set. "My men are expected to close with the enemy. A 5-round bolt action against a squad with MG-42s is not a fight. It is a slaughter. You have crates of Garens sitting in the bay marked A priority. I am requesting a transfer." Reed stood slowly, smoothing his tailored tunic. "Those weapons are assigned to A priority units. Your battalion is not on that list. Regulation requires that replacement units be issued standard-issue combat weapons before deployment," Dobbins countered, his voice rising just enough to draw attention from the nearby clerks. "Regulation also provides for theater-specific allocation based on unit classification," Reed replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "You seem confused about how this depot operates, Major. We keep separate inventories for a reason. Colored units are allocated B priority gear. It's a policy, not a suggestion." Dobbins felt the blood pulsing in his temples. "Policy is putting my men in graves before they even see a German." Reed gestured toward the door with an open palm. "If you have a problem with the logistics of this war, take it to the regional command. In this office, the decision is final. The Springfields are what you are getting. You are intentionally sending them into a disadvantage they cannot overcome," Dobbins stated, his voice now dangerously low. "I am managing inventory, Major," Reed corrected, sitting back down. "And I don't appreciate being lectured by someone who clearly doesn't understand the hierarchy of importance here. You have your orders, and you have your equipment. Good day." Dobbins stared at him for a long moment, then turned on his heel. He didn't head for the exit. He headed for the field telephone. He bypassed the local chain of command entirely. The report reached Patton within the hour. The depot gates groaned as a olive-drab jeep tore through the perimeter, dust billowing in its wake. It did not stop for the guard. It rolled directly to the center of the yard and came to a halt. The dust settled to reveal the 4 stars on a steel helmet and the ivory-handled revolvers buckled at the hips of General George S. Patton. He stepped out of the vehicle, his presence pulling the oxygen from the air. Every officer, every clerk, and every soldier froze in their tracks. Patton did not look at the men. He walked straight toward the office of Captain Reed. He moved with a heavy, deliberate stride. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked into the room, his eyes locking onto the ordnance officer as the door clicked shut behind him. Patton stopped inches from Reed's desk. He looked at the Springfield rifle lying on the table, then at the M1 Garand resting against the wall. He did not ask for a report. He asked a question. "Captain, what criteria are you using to classify the fighting men of this army?" Reed shifted, his face losing its color. Patton did not blink. He asked again, colder this time. "Tell me who gave you the authority to decide which American soldier deserves a rifle that fires and which one gets a club." Reed stammered, trying to justify his inventory system. Patton cut him off with a third question. How many men have you sent to the front with outdated steel to face automatic fire, and how many of them have failed to return? Patton stared at the man until the silence became physical. He finally spoke, his voice low, steady, and sharp as a razor. You talk of A priority and B priority, as if this war were a ledger in a bank back in New Jersey. War is not a ledger. War is a meat grinder. You have taken boys who volunteered to fight for their country, and you have stripped them of their only means of survival based on a prejudice that has no place in my command. You call the Springfield adequate. I call it a murder weapon when matched against an enemy with an MG-42. You have made a choice, Captain. You have chosen to treat your own soldiers as expendable byproducts of a broken, bigoted system. I have chosen to clear that system out. Every man in my army is a soldier. Every soldier is entitled to the best equipment that can be put in his hands. You have treated these men as less than equals, and you have documented it with your own hand. You have managed your inventory with hate, and now you will see what that hate produces. You have a choice to make, right here, right now. You can spend the rest of this war fighting for your life with the very equipment you forced on these men. Or you can step away from this desk and be court-martialed for sabotaging the combat effectiveness of this unit. Either way, you are done. Your days of playing God with supply lists are over. Decide now. You have 10 seconds to tell me why you shouldn't be on the first transport to the front lines with nothing but that rifle in your hands. Patton signaled to 2 of his MPs, who stepped forward and cleared the office in seconds. Reed watched, trembling, as his meticulous inventory system was dismantled. Patton ordered the immediate seizure of every ledger, every manifest, and every supply sheet Reed had used to enforce his 2-tier code. The MPs dragged the heavy metal cabinets out into the center of the muddy depot yard, where a crowd of soldiers, mechanics, and drivers had already gathered. Patton gestured toward the crates of Springfields and the stockpiled Garans. He ordered his men to drag the old bolt-action rifles into the center of the circle, forming a high, jagged pile. Then, he commanded that the modern semi-automatics be opened and distributed, rifle by rifle, directly to the men of Dobbin's battalion. Reed was forced to stand in the mud, watching the systematic dismantling of his authority. The smell of gun oil and wet earth filled the air as the soldiers swapped their outdated 5-round relics for the reliable power of the M1. When the last rifle was handed over, Patton walked to the center of the circle, picked up a single Springfield, and dropped it into the mud. He left it there, a symbol of the discarded ideology that had failed the men it was meant to equip. Major Dobbin survived the war, returning to a Georgia that had not yet shed its old skin, yet he carried the memory of that day as a quiet testament to the possibility of change. He became a teacher, spending 3 decades in local classrooms where he spoke little of the tactical details of 1944, but focused instead on the necessity of integrity in the face of institutional rot. He passed away in 1988, having lived to see his grandchildren enter a world that looked, however slowly, more like the one he had fought to make possible. Captain Wallace Reed did not fare as well. Stripped of his commission and dishonorably discharged, he spent 18 months in a military stockade for his role in the deliberate sabotage of unit readiness. He returned to New Jersey in 1946, a bitter and diminished man who found no place for himself in the post-war world. He lived in near-total isolation for the next 40 years, working as a night clerk until his death in 1986, never once reconciling with the reality of what his choices had cost the men under his command. General Patton never spoke of the incident in his public memoirs or official briefings. However, he kept Dobbin's report, marked in red ink, and filed deep within his personal desk for the remainder of his life. In a private letter to his wife, he wrote only a single sentence: "Sometimes, the greatest enemy of a winning army is not the man in the trench across the field, but the man in the office behind the lines who thinks he is above the rules of human decency." Some historians have argued that administrative bottlenecks were an inevitable consequence of the rapid chaotic advance across France, and that racial prejudices were merely a reflection of the broader, deeply flawed American social order at the time. Others have argued that military necessity necessitated strict logistical prioritization, and that Patton's interference disrupted the delicate, albeit exclusionary, supply chain established by ordnance officers. What is certain is that after that day in Le Mans, the systematic distribution of inferior equipment to black units at that depot ceased entirely, setting a rare, localized precedent for combat equality that would eventually be echoed across the entire theater of operations. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have allowed the ordnance officer to continue his distribution policy to avoid a conflict with logistical regulations? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.